The void between stars was never truly empty. It just held its breath until something worth devouring drifted close. And tonight, the Red Dragon Pack had come to feast. Their war barges tore through the Kuiper Belt like blades through silk, obsidian hulls shimmering with the heat haze of re-entry-ready plasma shields. Inside, 50 war-born drakes of the Xi-Thari brood flexed claws that had carved cities into graveyards across 3 spiral arms. Their commander, Vorgoth the Scarred, stood at the prow of the flagship Ashfang, eyes burning like dying suns. He'd tracked the scent of the stolen hatchlings through ion trails and encrypted distress beeps, trails that ended not at some fortified xenohive or quantum vault, but on a pale blue dot called Earth. "Fools," he hissed, his voice a tectonic growl modulated through the ship's translator. "They kept the younglings alive. They think mercy will spare them." The fleet descended in silence, bypassing orbital defenses like ghosts. Human satellites blinked out one by one, not destroyed, but gently disabled, as if swatted aside by a bored god. They landed not in a capital, not in a military complex, but in the rolling green hills of Appalachia, where the air smelled of pine, damp earth, and something warm. Vorgoth led the charge himself, his armored bulk cracking asphalt with every step. The humans had barricaded a farmhouse, wooden beams, a rusted pickup in the yard, a swing swaying in the breeze. No turrets, no energy barriers, just an old radio crooning some mournful country song through a cracked window. He ripped the front door off its hinges. Inside, moonlight spilled across a worn rug. And there, in a recliner patched with duct tape, sat a human. Not cowering, not armed, just sitting. Curled against his chest like sun-warmed stones were 3 Xi-Thari hatchlings, tiny, scaled, their breathing soft as starlight. One had its snout tucked under the human's chin, another clutched a frayed flannel sleeve like a security blanket, the third was drooling on his thigh. The human, male, mid-50s, eyes tired but calm, looked up at Vorgoth and the dozen snarling war drakes filling his doorway. He didn't flinch, just adjusted the blanket over the smallest hatchling. "You're late," he said, voice rough but steady. "They missed their bedtime." Vorgoth froze. His neural spines flared crimson. The instinct to incinerate, to reduce this insolent mammal to ash, surged through his blood. But then, the hatchling stirred. The one on the man's chest yawned, blinked sleepy golden eyes, and chirped, a sound the brood hadn't heard from their young in cycles. Not since the hive purges, not since they'd been taught that tenderness was weakness. You nurtured them?" Vorgoth's translator crackled, struggling from the shift from wrath to wonder. The human nodded slowly, found him shivering in a wrecked escape pod near the old coal mine. Looked scared, starving, so I fed him oatmeal. Sang him that old lullaby my granddaddy used to hum, "You are my sunshine." Didn't know what else to do. One of the younger drakes behind Vorgoth let out a choked sound, almost a sob. Hatchlings weren't supposed to survive without brood milk and sonic resonance chambers. Yet here they were, plump, calm, their scales gleaming with health. The human reached into his pocket and pulled out a slightly bent harmonica. He said, "They like this one best," and played 3 gentle notes that hung in the air like suspended stars. Outside, the war barges powered down their weapons. The sky, once choked with threat, softened into something resembling dawn. Vorgoth stepped forward, his clawed hand trembling as it hovered over the head of the largest hatchling. The little one reached up, tiny talons brushing the scar that ran from Vorgoth's brow to jaw, the mark of a battle he'd won but never healed from. "They call you Papa Dan now," the human said quietly. "Didn't ask, just started saying it in their sleep." For the first time in centuries, the scarred one of the Red Dragon Pack felt something unfamiliar coil in his chest. Not rage, not vengeance, but the quiet, terrifying weight of something like hope. He lowered himself to one knee, massive frame folding with impossible gentleness, and bowed his head, not in surrender, but in awe. Because the hatchlings weren't just alive, they were
The old
loved.
harmonica played
and love,
on,
it turned out,
weaving
was a
through the
language
silence
even
as
dragons
the stars
forgot they
outside
knew.
leaned closer to listen, and somewhere deep in the bones of the farmhouse, a kettle began to whistle, because Papa Dan always made tea after bedtime. The harmonica's last note faded into the hush of a world holding its breath. Outside, the war barges, once engines of annihilation, hovered like penitent giants, their crimson hulls dimming to the soft amber of embers cooling in reverence. Vorgoth remained on one knee, his war-scarred face inches from the sleeping hatchling, its tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm with the human's heartbeat. In that fragile symphony of breath and silence, something ancient cracked open, not just in him, but in every dragon who had forgotten that strength could cradle, not just crush. Papa Dan didn't move, didn't speak. He just let the moment swell, thick with meaning, like the first rain after a century-long drought. And then from the back of the room, one of the younger drakes, barely past his first molt, stepped forward. His claws, still too sharp for his own frame, clicked softly against the hardwood floor. He lowered his snout toward the human's outstretched hand, not in submission, but in something far rarer among warriors: trust. What happened next rippled across the galaxy faster than any plasma beam. Within cycles, the Red Dragon Pack, once the terror of the Orion Arm, began dismantling its war fleets, not by decree, but by instinct. Hulls were reforged into mobile nurseries. Weaponaries became climate regulators for orphaned biodomes. And the Zythari brood, a species hardened by eons of blood and survival, started asking questions they'd long buried. What if we protect instead of conquer? What if we build instead of burn? All because a lonely widower in West Virginia chose kindness over fear. The hatchlings never left Earth, not really. They grew, yes, towering, magnificent, their scales catching firelight like molten rubies. But their hearts stayed rooted in that farmhouse, in the smell of cornbread and old books, in the rough timber of a man who taught them that courage wasn't measured in kills, but in lullabies sung in the dark. Vorgoth became their guardian, their bridge between worlds. He stood watch over the farm not as a conqueror, but as a sentinel of a new covenant. When human children from nearby towns came to visit, wide-eyed, clutching drawings of dragons with smiling faces, he'd lower his massive head and let them braid wildflowers into his spines. And every evening, without fail, he'd sit on the porch with Papa Dan, sipping bitter herbal tea from a chipped mug twice his claw size, watching the sunset paint the hills in the same gold as his hatchling's eyes. News of the Earth Truce spread, not through treaties or broadcasts, but through whispers carried on refugee ships, through traders who spoke of a planet where even monsters learned to love. Other broods, scarred by their own wars, began sending emissaries not with weapons, but with eggs. Fragile, trembling eggs entrusted to human hands because they'd heard the legend. On the blue world, they don't break you, they raise you. And humanity, we didn't become gods or saviors. We simply remembered our oldest power, the one that predates cities, nations, even language itself, the power to care for what's small and scared and not our own.
Years later, when Papa Dan's hair turned white as starlight and his steps grew slow, the dragons built him a chair under the old oak, woven from star alloy and mountain wood, warm to the touch, strong enough to hold galaxies. And every night, without fail, one of the hatchlings, now mighty warlords in their own right, would curl around him like a living fortress, wings wrapped tight, humming that old country tune off-key, just the way he taught them. The universe kept spinning. Wars still raged in distant sectors. Empires still rose and fell. But Earth became something else entirely. Not a target, not a resource, a sanctuary, a promise written not in stone, but in the quiet rhythm of a human heartbeat under dragon scales. And if you ever find yourself on a quiet hill in Appalachia just after dusk, listen closely. Beneath the wind and the crickets, you might hear it. That soft, rumbling purr of contentment, the whisper of wings folding in peace, and the gentle strum of a harmonica playing "You Are My Sunshine," not as a song of longing, but as a vow. Because in the end, it wasn't firepower or technology that saved us. It was a man who chose to sing instead of scream, and the dragons who finally remembered how to listen.